guys, Zach with Wire Customs, and today we are splitting the wishbone on a Model A Ford. Alright, so truth be told, this is a very easy thing to do. We're going to knock this out today. I'm going to show you every step of the way. It's very simple. Okay, so when you're going from 4-cylinder to flathead V8 in a Model A, or even a V8 in general in your Model A, you're going to have to split the wishbones. Now, I've seen guys build a whole bunch of stuff to keep the wishbone together. For me, that's a lot of too much work. This is a lot easier than doing all that. And on top of that, if you're going to lower the car significantly, it's actually really good to split them so you can get the wishbones up higher instead of so low, because that'll keep the car from being as low as it possibly can. These are hollow, so they're actually really easy to split. We have a weld seam right here in the middle. I'm going to grind all the old oil off of this so I can see the weld seam really well. Then what you're going to do is just cut it at that weld seam. Now when you go to make this cut, this is really important to have your measurements right. You can just cut it on the welds. That works, but if you really want to be meticulous, take your time. Go from the spring perch right here in the front all the way back to the weld and measure that. Then do the exact same thing on the other side, so both radius rods when cut are the exact same length. That's important, but if you're cutting and you make a little bit of mistake, like an 1/8 inch mistake, we can make up for that later on. Just to be honest with you, try to do it as best you can, but it's not, you didn't ruin it if you made a mistake. Once we cut these open, they'll be hollow. We'll stick a threaded bung on it so we can actually thread in a bigger style tie rod on the end of these. So let's get started. So when you're trying to figure out which end you want to cut it on the weld, you're going to cut it on the radius rod end of the weld, not the wishbone end of the weld, okay? Because these are double walled and they're welded in here at the very end. So if you cut it on the wrong side, we're going to miss that little window of having it open in the center, because we're going to slide our new bungs to the open center. Alright, so now that we got that all cut off, it's nice and smooth, nice and flat. I went ahead and beveled the edges all the way around because this is such thick steel. I want to get as much penetration with the weld as possible. Then I also beveled off the edges on the bungs. These are the bungs right here. And these fit right into that open hole, and you're just going to weld these two together. Make sure your lengths are as even as possible, and just make sure you get really good clean welds. So I ground down at least 1 inch all the way around my weld, so when that heat penetrates, it's not burning anything off the sides. It's going to be a clean, crisp weld. Also, I'm going to have my ground clamp as close as possible, so it's going to be about right there, and I clean the ground off really well. These welds are really important because this is safety, so burn them hot, make sure they're flat. Time for some good welds. Now I welded this as hot as I could with my welder. I think it laid pretty flat. I'm going to clean it up not to hide my welds. Anyone who's done a lot of welding on old metal with new metal understands the new metal has a little bit of impurities on the inside of it, and when you go to weld on it, it could bubble out and leave you a little air gap inside your weld. So when I grind these down a little bit, I didn't grind them down completely smooth. When you grind these down, you can actually see, was there a bubble formulated inside the weld or not. Now, I'm not a metallurgist, I can't tell you exactly what's going on in there, but what I can tell you is an air gap in your weld, it's not good. So just grind it down far enough to double check that there's no air gaps in your weld. Once you have that set up and it cools down naturally, I've been taught through a lot of very experienced hot rodders to never cool things down with water. You can cool sheet metal down by blowing air on it. If you're in a hurry with this, let this cool down by blowing air out of it out of your air compressor. But we don't want it to cool off too fast Once you get that bung welded on, go ahead and put the tie rod on. Now that it's cooled down and the jam nut's still on that tie rod end. Count how many times you twist it down. So we can put both tie rods in at the same length. Try to get it somewhere in the middle of that tie rod end on the thread so you can go in and out with it quite a bit. So now we want to put the axle back on the frame with the springs that you're actually going to be using. Make sure you get it set up how it's actually going to be driving down the road, because this is going to determine the caster angle, and it's going to be actually very important. On a Model A, the caster angle is 7 degrees positive. I have mine set at 12. From what I'm told, 7 to 15 is the sweet spot. As long as side to side it's exactly the same. The guys who race these early Fords usually go for more, as in like 12 to 15 range for caster. The guys who are running more stock, more street, usually around 7 to 10. That's not just my experience, that's what I've heard from other people as well. So take that with a grain of salt. Kind of pick where you want yours to be within the range of how you're going to be driving the car. Now what you're going to do is get a jack stand or anything that you can that's adjustable on the very end of these radius rods and check your caster angle. Figure out how far from the frame that tie rod end has to be for it to be the right caster angle. If you're pushing the end of the radius rod up, that's going to go in a negative, that's going to give you less caster. If you're bringing it further down, that's going to give you more positive caster. If you want to know more about straight axle front end alignments, I actually have a video just on alignments on straight axles by itself, explaining all the different degrees. Go and check that out. So when you're setting up your caster, make sure you do it with all the intended weight that the vehicle is going to have actually on the springs. The spring compressing and decompressing actually changes that angle. So make sure you have all the weight on there. Once you have the correct caster degrees that you want, make sure the front and back of the axle, side to side of the axle, is even. Pick a point on the frame that's in the exact same spot on both sides, measure it to the very end of your axle, and make sure the axle is pointed true and straight in the frame. Once you have it true and straight and you have your caster correct by on jack stands or something that you have that's adjustable to lift those radius rod ends up and down, that's going to give your measurement for the drop. My drop is pretty excessive for that tie rod end on the radius rod. That's because I'm running a highboy and I didn't go the extra mile to pie cut my radius rod. So let me show you a front end on a 47 Ford and show you how the radius rod is completely straight and they got that corrective angle by, they didn't cut it in the factory, but if we had to do it on the Model A, we're gonna have to pie cut it to move the end of that radius rod. I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so welcome to my little parts bin area out here in the pole barn. So this is a 1947 Ford front axle. Now even just looking at the axle, you can see that this axle alone would give Model A a drop. So if you just switch axle to axle, it's going to lower the front end down. But what I really want to show you is how these radius rods are no longer straight on the early Fords. I'm trying to think what year that actually changed. I think that changed mid-30s. Maybe 33, 34, I'm not exactly sure. But just pay attention when you get a front end for your hot rod that you're building, how the radius rod, if it's straight or not. But they still split exactly the same.
Now you can see here a pretty significant arch. It's going to get you over your steering linkage, at least a stock axle steering linkage, but it's also going to give you some of your caster angle that's corrected without as big of a drop.
Quite a bit of time has passed since I started this video. I had to build this car in 28 days, get it running and driving in 28 days. So I filmed some of the stuff as I was going along, and the beginning part of this video was a part of that. I cut a couple corners to get it done that fast, and I'm going to explain what corners I cut so you don't have to do it yourself if you're watching this video to learn. Since mine's a highboy, my drop had to be very low to get 12 degrees. So that's why I have such big low drop on here. Now, for me, when I was doing this in 28 days, it was a lot faster to just build a big drop, weld it in, get the axle on. The better option, the more professional option for you to do, which I intend on doing now that I have more time, is cutting the radius rod in a pie cut. But you can cut it, get the degree correct for the caster, then weld it back up. That's probably your best option if you're running a highboy. If we're running a low boy, dropped axle, dropped everything, that's going to change a lot of your measurements. So sometimes they don't even need a drop. Sometimes the guys are so Z'd and so low that the radius rod is already sticking through the frame. So I've seen that before. So make sure your measurement's correct. And when it comes to just splitting the wishbones by itself, there's not too much more that we could really go over. It's actually really straightforward. I would consider it pretty easy. Hopefully you consider it easy as well. Just make sure your steering linkage can clear the radius rods. Sometimes guys run suicide, so they flip the spindles from side to side so the steering linkage is in the front. So we call that kind of like a suicide setup because they don't have the room for the drag link to go underneath the spindle. Sometimes some guys actually run it through hairpins. When a car is really low and they use hairpins, you can run the steering linkage through the hairpin itself. But when it comes to old school wishbone style, this is kind of what we got set up with. So if you have any questions, shoot them down in the comment section. Like, share, subscribe to the channel. Stop watching YouTube and get your shit together.